By the time Eli Carter asked Charlotte Beaumont to the barn dance, everyone in Dry Creek had an opinion, and only the stars kept their counsel. The town stretched like a faded ribbon along Farm to Market 117, one cafe, one church, one stoplight that spent most days blinking yellow, as if apologizing for interrupting the horizon. On Tuesday mornings, the feed store opened early, not so much for commerce as for company, and the smell of cracked corn and baling twine mixed with coffee that tasted like it had been reheated since the Reagan years. Eli stood in that smell with a handwritten list and a wallet thin enough to pass any test of humility. String for the baler, 2 salt blocks, and he peered at his list as if squinting might collapse the numbers into something kinder. And a sack of range cubes, if I can get 'em on credit till the calves ship. Walt behind the counter, forearms like oak limbs, and the everlasting squint of a man who distrusts optimism, settled his elbows on the register. You Carter boys always ask polite. I'll give you that. He tipped his chin toward the old coffee pot. Take a cup. It'll give you courage or ulcers, Eli poured. He was 28, but wore his years in the corners of his eyes more than in his stride. Poor wasn't the word he used for himself unless he was alone, but the math was plain. Drought 2 summers running, diesel high, an old F-250 that drank like a sailor, and a mortgage on 48 tired acres that his father had mortgaged again before the cancer took him. What Eli had was a straight back, a willingness to work, and a mother who still hummed hymns while she shelled peas in the evenings. Sometimes that felt like enough. Sometimes it felt like a story he told himself, so sleep would come. "You all here?" Walt said, because he never could let silence sit. "Beaumont's girl is back. Saw her white truck by the courthouse yesterday. Fancy as a dentist's watch." "Back from where?" asked Mrs. Alvarez, who came in for chick grit and stayed for news. "Austin, or New York, or Mars. Folks say she got more degrees than a thermometer." Walt chuckled at his own joke and waited for someone to agree that it was funny. Eli didn't bite. He knew the Beaumonts the way a man knows the weather, powerful, changeable, indifferent to your plans. Wade Beaumont owned more acres than anyone should be able to see at one time, and had a talent for turning pasture into money, even when everyone else was praying over grass seeds. His daughter Charlotte had left for college when Eli was in high school. He remembered a girl who'd driven through town with the windows up, not snooty exactly, just elsewhere, like home was something she'd carry in her backpack and not in her boots. "Barn dance on Saturday," Mrs. Alvarez said, as if the universe required a reminder. "Roping clinic in the afternoon, brisket at 5, band at 7. I got grandnieces coming. They'll need watching eyes so they don't fall in love with the wrong boys." Walt leaned over the counter. "Carter, you going?" Thinking on it. Eli wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. He owned 2 shirts he'd called good. Both faded just enough to make honesty look like style. A barn dance didn't cost a man much except the price of being seen. "Take a girl," Walt said. "Even the Lord wanted company. Might soften that frown." Eli smiled without his teeth. "Who you got in mind?" Walt flicked his eyes toward the door. A white truck rolled past, the kind that looked like money had washed it because soap wasn't wealthy enough. It turned into the courthouse square and parked under the post oak, whose limbs made a lace of shade before noon. The driver climbed out, boots first, then jeans, then a woman with a braid like a rope and a face that had learned its edges somewhere a long way from Dry Creek. Charlotte Beaumont closed her door with the calm of a person who believes every latch was made to obey her. "She's out of your league," Walt said, because someone had to say it for the story to start. "Most ball games don't have leagues in Dry Creek," Eli said. "Just fences and folks who lean on them." Mrs. Alvarez snorted. "I never did like the way we talk ourselves small. If a man can mend wire and keep his word, he can ask any woman to 2-step. Whether she says yes is her business. Whether he's brave enough to hear no is his." Eli drank the rest of his coffee like it might have courage in it. He paid for the baling twine and the salt, told Walt he'd settle the range cubes next week, and pushed through the screen door into a morning that was already thinking about heat. The courthouse square was a ring of cracked pavement, a barber pole, a mechanic shop that wrote its hours with a grease pencil on the window, and a law office that smelled like paper and patience. Charlotte stood at the bulletin board, reading a flyer about the dance, the wind lifting the corner of the page so it slapped lightly against the thumbtack. He could have kept walking. He could have admired the truck and thought about diesel prices and gone home to fix the leaky trough, but his mother's voice rode up in him, soft as a hymn and stubborn as a burr. "You can be poor and proud at once, son, but don't be proud instead of brave. Pride never fed a calf." He crossed the street. "Ma'am," he said, because that's what his mouth did when it couldn't find a better word fast enough. She turned. Up close, she looked like the summer had been kind to her. Freckles awake, eyes a color that in Dry Creek you only found in a glint of river water under a cottonwood. She didn't smile like in magazines, big and shiny. She smiled like a person who listened before she answered. "Charlotte," she said, offering her hand. "I figure we don't need Mr. or Miss in front of names unless we're mad at each other." "Eli," he said, taking her hand. It fit smaller than he expected and stronger. "I know." She nodded toward his truck. "You pulled my dad's stuck trailer out of a fence last August with that Ford. I was on FaceTime from 3 time zones away while he cussed your chain in all the languages he knows. He never did say thank you like he should have." "Wasn't any trouble." Eli let go of her hand. "That chain's been cussed by better men than him." She laughed, the kind of laugh that loosened the air. "You headed to the dance Saturday?" "Thinking on it." "You should go," she said. "A town that dances together makes better mistakes." "Is that from law school or life?" "Life. Law school doesn't believe in 2 steps." She looked back at the flyer. "You asking somebody?" He swallowed. The courthouse bell on top of the square tower watched with its lidless stone eye. "I was," he said, "about to ask you." He felt the world suspend itself, the way the day holds its breath before the first fat drop of a summer storm. It wasn't just that she was rich and he wasn't. It was how Dry Creek held memory. Every kid who'd dented a truck bed, every woman who'd volunteer cooked for funerals, every rancher who'd sold a herd low because the grass had given up. They'd all look at this moment later and make something of it that might or might not match the truth. He said it anyway. "You can't learn to saddle a horse by staring at the cinch." "Charlotte," he said, and if his voice shook, it did so privately, "will you go with me to the barn dance?" He didn't add qualifiers. As friends, as a dare, as social experiment. He didn't hedge. He let the question stand on its own boots. She didn't look shocked. She looked like someone aligning a map with the landscape. "What would that mean to you?" she asked. Not coy, not hard, just careful. "It'd mean I'd get to walk you in and make sure you didn't step in the one muddy patch we always get by the lemonade stand. It'd mean I'd try not to hitch my thumbs in my pockets when I'm nervous, because my mama says it makes me look like I'm waiting for life to apologize. It'd mean I'd ask you for the first dance and the last and let you choose the middle." She studied him as if he were a set of directions printed too small. The wind tugged a wisp of hair loose from her braid. She tucked it back the way women do when they're thinking big and chewing small. "Okay," she said. "Yes." He heard the word before he felt it, and for a beat, he was a boy again with a new pair of boots and a summer that hadn't learned what bills were. Then the rest of the square came back into focus. Mr. Kim at the convenience store pretending not to watch, the barber pausing with his scissors mid-air, Mrs. Alvarez grinning like she'd sold a dozen extra chicks just by willing it so. "7?" he asked, and she nodded. "7. My truck or yours?" "Mine," he said, "so I can open your door and make your father mad properly." He meant for it to be a joke, but her smile thinned. "He'll be fine," she said, and in the space the words didn't fill, Eli heard the truth. Wade Beaumont would not be fine, not with his daughter accepting an invitation he hadn't written. They parted, and Eli felt the whole town exhale around him, the way the prairie lets go of heat when the sun slides west. He drove back to his place by the creek, where the cottonwoods made a green tunnel that in July felt like mercy. The house needed paint, and the porch sagged on the left, but the light lay kindly on it. His mother, Ruth, was shelling purple hull peas into a stainless bowl and listening to a radio show where a woman from Abilene told callers not to marry men who couldn't read their own oil dipsticks. "You look like somebody who got good news and pretends it's neutral," she said without looking up. "I asked a girl to the dance," he said, trying for neutral and failing. "Which one?" She didn't pretend not to care. "Beaumont's." Ruth's hands paused, pea-hull mid-snap. "You asked the girl or the family?" "The girl." He leaned against the door jamb. "And she said yes." Ruth snapped the pea-hull the rest of the way open and smiled into the bowl. "Well, the Lord does like to surprise me before lunch." "She knows what she's doing," he said because he wanted to believe it. "She's sharp." "A sharp girl and a poor boy can cut a new pattern if they mind their fingers," Ruth said. "Get your good shirt. The one that says you know how to iron, not the one that says you lost the iron in 2009. He chuckled. "We even own an iron." "I own an iron," she said. "You own the privilege of pretending it appears by magic." That night, after chores, he cleaned the truck like he was preparing it to meet a judge. He scrubbed the bugs off the windshield with newspaper because his father had sworn it worked better than any fancy blade. He found the packet of peppermint his mother kept in the glove box for long rides and threw out the trail of receipts that said nothing flattering about his finances. He laid his good shirt over the back of a chair and stared at it as if it might tell him how to behave when he was standing next to someone whose shadow made certain men nervous. Across town, in a house that had been designed by an architect with a soft spot for varnish, Charlotte stood in front of a closet that could have fed a family of 5 if you priced it in dresses. When she came back to Dry Creek, she hadn't planned on this. She'd planned on spending 2 months assessing the ranch assets like a project manager, writing memos that her father would ignore less if they came on expensive letterhead. She hadn't planned on one quiet man with careful hands offering a question so clean she couldn't find a reason to dirty it. Her father knocked once and entered without waiting, because that is what men do when they believe every door still belongs to them. Wade Beaumont was 56, silver at the temples in a way that made realtors chase him with brochures. He wore a shirt that believed in starch and an expression that believed in its own logic. "You making friends with the locals?" he asked, smiling the thin kind. "Always did have more in common with people who ride fences than with people who sell them," she said. He frowned. "I heard you're going to the dance with Carter." "News travels faster than trucks," Charlotte said. I told him yes. "There are optics to consider. There are people to consider," she said, "and I'm one of them." He shook his head as if he could rattle out the last of her childhood and pour it down the drain. "Be pleasant, Lottie, but remember your lane." "I'm driving," she said gently. "Lanes are choices." He left with a set jaw, and she let herself feel small for exactly 6 breaths. Then she opened the cedar chest at the foot of her bed and took out a dress that had belonged to her grandmother. Blue cotton, nothing fancier than a hem she'd shortened herself when she was 17, and impatient with how long fabric thought legs should be. She laid it over the chair and set her boots beside it, scuffed in a way that told a truer story than any shoe kept for Sunday. Saturday came baked in sun. All day, Dry Creek prepared. Briskets smoked and made the air smell like generous plans. The high school ag kids strung lights in the rafters of the Grange Hall, and Mrs. Alvarez stirred a pot of pinto beans so big it would have fed an army if the army had been sensible enough to come ask. Around 5, Eli shaved with care and nicked himself once because you cannot fix a man's nerves without drawing a dot of blood. At 6:52, he pulled into the Beaumont Drive, which was not a drive so much as an announcement about money's ability to widen distance. He parked under the pecans because shade belongs to everyone and rang the bell that had a deeper voice than any bell needs. Charlotte came down the steps with her braid over one shoulder and the blue dress that made her look like the very best of plain. Eli's heart did the unmanly thing it does when a man sees taste he can trust. "You look nice," he said, which in his language meant beautiful. "So do you," she said, which in hers meant seen. He opened her truck door like his mother had raised him, even though it was his truck, and the sky above them held its blue like a breath it was glad to keep. On the road to the Grange Hall, they passed pastures that needed rain, and a river that went thin around its bends, and a set of kids on a culvert sticking their feet into water because you can be poor, but you don't have to be uncheered. They didn't say much. Some silences are a table set for supper. When they turned into the gravel lot, the band was just tuning, and the sun caught the dust, so it looked like someone had shaken glitter out of a storybook. Eli pulled in between a dented Chevy and a Buick that belonged to a widow who parallel parked like a pro. He looked at Charlotte once, quick, like a man checking the cinch before he climbs aboard. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," she said, and they walked across the yard as if nothing in all the county could shift under their feet. Two people, one question already asked, and one night unspooling like a promise they were both brave enough to believe, at least until the stars had their say. The barn dance did what barn dances are supposed to do. It made strangers neighbors and neighbors kin for the space of a song. The Grange Hall's rafters had held 50 harvests worth of laughter and sorrow, and that night they held fiddles and a steel guitar, and a drummer who kept time the way a man keeps a promise, steady without fancy, with the kind of patience that makes everyone else sound better. Kids ran in loops that made adults nervous and then proud. The church ladies behind the pie table dispensed pecan triangles as if flinging absolution with a crust. Eli paid for 2 lemonades, and Charlotte set her cup down with the carefulness of someone who knows that tipping sugar water onto a borrowed dress will stain memory as well as cotton. He felt like the clock had paused just long enough for him to notice his own life. Men clapped him on the back, the way men do when they're glad, but trying not to startle an idea. Women measured Charlotte with their eyes and decided in their hearts whether to be kind. Mrs. Alvarez slid past and pinched Eli's forearm, which is how she distributed both love and discipline. "First dance," he said, when the band leader, a man with a mustache that had outlived 2 trends and a marriage, announced a 2-step. "Let's make your mama proud," she said, and set her right hand on his shoulder as if it had always been there. He wasn't the best dancer, he knew that. But he knew the floor, and he knew the music, and he knew how to pay attention. And paying attention gets you further than talent when talent is lazy. Charlotte followed, with the ease of someone who won't make a man pay for trying. They turned, the boards under them sure, the lights strung along the rafters making halos out of dust. For 2 songs, their conversation was feet and hands and breath. Between numbers, they found the edge of the hall and let the night blow on them. The air outside smelled like cut hay and spilled beer, and a little like nostalgia, because Dry Creek always smelled a little like something you once had and were trying to remember how to keep. "You always come to these?" Charlotte asked. "When I can," he said. "Sometimes the fence has different plans." "What's your favorite thing about living here?" He thought about lying and saying the sun sets or the way the river throws light back on your face if you stand in it and ask nicely. But lies turn to salt in your mouth without warning. "My favorite thing is that when you break down, somebody stops," he said. "You cannot like a man and still pull him out of a ditch. It's an ethic, I understand. Straightforward. Practical kindness." She took that in, nodded. "I forgot what that felt like," she said. "Where I've been, it's more transactional. Kindness has invoices." He glanced at her, surprised into a smile. "Invoices. Not literal ones. But everything costs something, and you pay even when you don't know the currency. You know what I miss?" She didn't wait for him to guess. "I miss being known in the way a place knows you. The clerk at the store asking how your aunt's hip is because she actually cares, not because she read it in a CRM. "I don't know what a CRM is," he said. "You're better off," she said, and they both laughed at how their words leaned toward each other and found easier ground. The band swung into a waltz, then a fast number that scattered couples like quail. Teenagers tried to look bored while making decisions that would chart their entire July. 2 boys in shirts their mama had ironed harder than peace elbowed each other over a girl who pretended not to notice. Over by the pie table, Ruth Carter and Pastor Luann argued quietly about the proper ratio of sugar to pecans. The night felt ordinary in a way that always deserves a blessing. Eli and Charlotte danced again. He wasn't much for talking while his boots were concentrating, but between songs he asked small questions that opened wider answers. He learned she'd studied environmental law and policy, which sounded to him like trying to get two mules to pull the same plow. She learned he'd taken a run at community college back when his father was in remission and had liked the English class best because stories give you a way to keep company with the dead. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "School. I miss reading books without falling asleep in the second chapter because my body thinks pages are lullabies," he said. "I miss believing that if I could explain something, I could fix it." She nodded in sympathy. That wasn't pity. Explaining is a skill. Fixing is a faith. Midway through the evening, the lights blinked. Nobody panicked. Old wiring, heavy load, a momentary hiccup. Then they blinked again and went out. For a breath, the hall held darkness like a gasp. Then someone opened the doors wide and the night came in with stars. It wasn't like city stars, that peppering you get between buildings if you're lucky. This was vast. Spray of light across the black, the Milky Way, a river nobody had yet dammed. Folks made the sound people make when they remember the world is bigger than the thing they're worried about. The band, because the band had been playing acoustic since before amplifiers were a rumor, kept going. Fiddles don't need your electricity to tell the truth. Eli and Charlotte drifted out with everyone else onto the grass where the dew had just started thinking about forming. The hall glowed behind them with generator lamps that made long shadows, and beyond that the prairie lay down like a dog at a man's feet. That's when they saw it, a thin line of orange along the northern horizon. Not sunrise, not moon, not anything friendly. A ribbon where no ribbon should be, moving wrong, licking up rather than laying down. "Fire," Eli said, his voice flat with recognition. "Where?" Charlotte asked, already pulling her phone out of her pocket like a soldier going for a well-oiled weapon. "Beyond County Road 9, east of the river, on your daddy's winter pasture flank." Eli listened to the wind without using his ears. Northwest breeze. If it runs the draws, it'll be at the old McCrae place in an hour. The word went through the crowd like a wire humming. Fire. No one screamed. People in Dry Creek have the sense to be afraid loudly only when it helps. The volunteer fire chief, Gabe Mendez, was already jogging toward his truck, the keys in his hand like a promise he'd made at 18 and kept. Ruth gathered children with a voice that could shepherd stray days, not just little boys. Mrs. Alvarez began filling coolers with water bottles as if quenching was her spiritual gift. Charlotte's thumbs spun across her screen. "Calling my father," she said. "He at the house?" Eli asked. "Or at the sale barn in San Marcos, feeding his habit for men, telling him he's right?" "Call anyway," Eli said. "Tell him we need gates open along the river, both of them. If we can draft water from the north gate and the south gate, we won't lose 10 minutes moving trucks. And tell him to get the dozer out of the shed now." She listened to him like he'd earned the right to give orders, hit call and turned away slightly. "Daddy," she said when he picked up, "we've got a grass fire on the north side moving toward McCrae. You need to open the river gates now and get the dozer fueled," he argued, "because men like Wade always do." She bit off words she wanted to say and said the useful ones instead. "No, this is not a drill. Yes, I know what liability means. If we don't open those gates, we'll be liable for a lot more than a chain lock. Do it, now." He said something sharp and hung up. She looked at Eli. "He's moving." "Good," Eli said. "Come on." They moved as if choreography had been written on the grass in chalk only they could see. Eli grabbed shovels, flappers, those wide rubber paddles on sticks the old-timers swear by, and threw them into the back of his truck along with the 5-gallon jugs of water he always kept, because hope is not a plan. Charlotte climbed in the passenger side without being invited, because time had shifted into a currency with a cruel exchange rate. They fish-tailed out of the lot and onto the road, the horizon's orange line brightening like someone stoking a wrong stove. At County Road 9, the night got busy. Volunteers in yellow Nomex jackets pulled hose from a brush truck like magicians producing scarves, and neighbors in jeans and resolve beat the edges of the flames with flappers to smother the fire's thirst for air. The wind pushed mean. The sound was a thing you felt more than heard, a low animal hum. Eli parked by the north gate and saw, with that small flash of gratitude that keeps men from despair, that it stood open, chain-looped, but not locked. Wade's doing, or a hired hand's quick thinking, didn't matter. He and two others ran the hose down the path to the river, while Charlotte hauled a coupling that weighed what it weighed, and then some. She didn't ask how. She watched, learned, aligned. When the pump coughed and then took, delivering river into hose with a surly generosity, she grinned like a kid, and Eli felt a thread run between them he hadn't been aiming to throw. "Get that line along the fence," Gabe shouted. "We hold it there. We got a chance." The fire came in tongues. It licked dry reed and old mesquite bark and dead grass laid down by last winter's parsimony. Men and women beat and soaked, and in the ugly minute when someone's boot stuck a second too long in a gopher hole, Charlotte was there with a hand under his elbow and a word that wrenched him back upright and into his own life. 10 minutes in, Wade arrived, headlights swinging, the dozer's engine coughing awake behind him. He jumped out of the truck, shouted a name, half protest, half prayer. "Lottie!" She didn't look up. He paused, took in the sight of his daughter hauling line like a hand who'd been doing it all summer. Something changed about his face. He went soft around the mouth and hard around the eyes, which is how men look when love outvotes certainty. "You," he said to Eli, because men like him need to point while they're adjusting. "Carter, you take that south brake. I'll run the dozer along the draw. We pinch it." "Yes, sir," Eli said, not for deference, but because efficiency sometimes sounds like respect. He ran, and Charlotte ran with him, and the line they laid spit steam when it met the heat, and did the low, holy work of stopping a greed that does not negotiate. It could have gone bad. A gust could have thrown a sheet of flame in a direction that had not been briefed on community plans. A hose could have blown a coupling and turned a minute into a math that ends in tears. But it did not. They had enough water. They had enough hands. They had enough luck or providence or both, and the fire ran out of appetite right before the fence line gave up. When the last stubborn tongue was smothered and the dark took back its ground, a quiet fell that wasn't silence so much as relief catching its breath. Eli stood, hands on his knees, lungs heaving, and looked at Charlotte. Her braid had come half loose and ash smeared her cheek, and the hem of her dress had collected burrs like a woman collects family. Annoying, endearing, proof of proximity. She was grinning like she had been allowed to show the shape of herself and found it fit the world. His chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with smoke. "You okay?" he asked. She held up her palm, where a blister had just raised its small flag. "Mostly," she said. He tore a strip from his bandana and wrapped it, not tender because she didn't need tender that second, just competent. "I didn't think you'd know what to do," Wade said, coming up behind them, breath like a man who had argued with an engine and a memory, and both had talked back. Charlotte looked at him level. "You never asked what I know." He nodded slowly. "That's on me." Gabe clapped Eli on the shoulder. "Good work, Carter. If you ever want a second job that pays in bad coffee and gratitude, we'll put your name on a helmet." "I'm rich enough already," Eli said. And Charlotte laughed, because she understood exactly what he meant, and exactly how little it had to do with money. By the time they rolled hose and set the pump to sleep and thanked the river under their breath, the stars were back to being stars, indifferent and kind, both. The band at the hall had gone quiet, but a few hardy souls strummed guitars on the porch and sang the old songs, the ones you mostly remember, even if you think you forgot. People hugged in that awkward way you do when you survived something you maybe wouldn't have if you'd been alone. They all drove back to the hall, on roads that looked temporarily as if they'd been scared straight. There wasn't a last dance because the last dance had already happened, and it had been a line between orange and black, held. On the bench outside the Grange, under a string of lights powered by a generator that shrank the stars only a little, Eli and Charlotte sat with their paper cups and their tired bones, and the kind of silence that feels like company. "Thank you," Wade said, standing in front of them, hat in his hands, a posture he didn't like. "To both of you." "We were all there," Charlotte said. "It wasn't a two-person story." "Maybe not," Wade said. He looked at Eli, and the look was still complicated, but it held respect, like a new coin. "You asked my daughter to a dance." "Yes, sir." Eli kept his eyes on Wade's face, not to defy him, but to say, "I'm here and whole and not ashamed. Next time you ask her to fight fire, give an old man a minute to get his dozer started." "I'll keep that in mind," Eli said. Wade nodded once, turned to go, then turned back. "Got folks from Dallas sniffing around the north section again?" he said, as if he'd been forced to tell an unflattering truth about a friend. "RV resort, low-impact luxury, the slick kind of crime. I told him we were thinking, maybe we're not." He looked at Charlotte because at some point even a man with a long habit of deciding needs to learn a new verb. "We'll talk tomorrow." "Tomorrow," Charlotte said, and Eli could feel the word stack itself quietly, like lumber on a dry floor, useful if you measured right. They didn't dance a last waltz. They didn't need to. They had stood under the stars and chosen the same direction when it mattered. And for most people in Dry Creek, that counted more than all the sequences of heel-toe anyone has ever diagrammed. The night thinned. People carried coolers to trucks, and kids to beds, and pies back to fridges. Eli drove Charlotte home slow, not to stretch time, but to let it land. At her steps, he opened her door and handed her down like she was exactly as breakable as any of them, and exactly as tough. "Thank you for the dance," she said. "Thank you for the fire," he said. "Saturday started different than it finished," she said. "Stars'll do that," he said. "Or people," she said, "if they let 'em." He tipped his hat, because his body knew how to be gracious, even when his mind was still cataloguing the smells of mesquite and damp ash, and he drove away into a night that had stitched a new seam down the middle and held. The Monday after the fire, Dry Creek woke to the sound of hammers. That's what people do after a close call. They repair things they should have fixed last spring. Eli replaced the warped plank on his porch and hung the door straight with a wedge that a man named Vernon had carved at a church picnic during the Obama administration when boredom and a pocket knife had intersected. Ruth baked cornbread and wrapped half to take to the Mendez place because gratitude tastes best when spread. At the Beaumont ranch house, the conversation that had been deferred for years got tired of waiting. It sat down at the dining table that had never once hosted a meal without a centerpiece, and Wade and Charlotte joined it because sometimes the only way out of a feud is through a fork. "I had an offer," Wade said, and the word had sand on it. "They want the north section. Promised me a number I couldn't ignore. Said it'd keep us solvent when the cattle markets refused to behave like gentlemen. And in exchange, we hand over water rights, light pollution, traffic dust, and an entire season of strangers driving too fast on County Road 9, Charlotte said. We'll trade our dark sky for neon, our good neighbors for polite transients. Daddy, we can sell pasture and buy dollars, but we can't buy back sky. I can't graze ideals." Wade's voice was hoarse. "Banks don't take stars." "Some banks take easements," Charlotte said. She pulled a folder from her bag and slid it to him. "Conservation easement. We grant the land a set of promises. No subdivision, limited development, protection for the river corridor. In exchange, we get a tax benefit that doesn't solve all problems, but calms the loudest. We lease grazing at a fair rate to people like Eli, who make grass into beef the old-fashioned way. We keep the night dark. We keep the water honest. Wade looked at the documents like a man checking a horse's teeth and not trusting the seller. "You a lawyer now?" "I'm a daughter," she said, "and I'm tired of pretending I don't know how to use what I learned." "You didn't ask me," he said. "I am asking you," she said, "to partner, not to permission. I didn't raise you to—" "You did," she said, not unkindly. "You raised me to take care of what's mine. I'm telling you, this place is mine too, not because of ink, because of sweat on fence wire and smoke on dresses and names on pie plates." He slumped back and rubbed his face like he could rearrange the lines into a more favorable map. "And if I say no, I'll make it hard," she said. "Public comment, op-eds, the kind of meetings you hate where Mrs. Alvarez brings a microphone that doesn't amplify but emboldens. I'll be respectful. I'll be relentless." He laughed despite himself, a sharp bark that sounded like the first time a new dog acknowledges he's not the only male in the yard. "You got away with words." "Oh, you taught me to count," she said. "I learned to speak to the things that can't." He didn't say yes, and he didn't say no. He took the folder and went to his office where the sun hit the desk in a square that had witnessed more checks written than prayers said. He stared at the numbers until they stopped being theory and started being story. He'd wanted to be the kind of man people thank for landscapes they still have when their grandchildren are old. He had become the kind of man developers offer drinks to. It was not a fall from grace. It was a slide into habit. He got up, went to the door, and yelled like he had when Charlotte was 6, and he needed to know where the goat had gotten to. "Lottie!" She appeared quicker than the goat ever had. He held up the folder. "We do it your way," he said, "but we do it with the bank in the loop and a tax lawyer meaner than a cornered sow. I'm not losing the ranch because we saved the stars. We're keeping both," she said, stepping forward and wrapping him in a hug that lasted just long enough to restart something in both of them. The weeks that followed smelled like paper and grilled meat, because Dry Creek knows how to mix bureaucracy with barbecue until both go down easier. Charlotte set meetings with the land trust folks, people with dirt under their nails and master's degrees, which is a pairing Dry Creek approved of. Wade sat in, arms crossed, and asked questions that sounded like he'd read every line 3 times because he had. Eli came to the parts that were his: grazing leases, water access schedules, fence maintenance, and kept his eyes on the details that make or break neighborliness. "Grazing rotation like this," he said, running a finger over the map where the north section greened a little after late rains, "means we're not sucking the marrow out of her. Grass will put on weight if we let it breathe." "Grass and cattle both," Charlotte said. "Funny thing happens when you give a place the courtesy of your patience." News got out the way news does, at the cafe, through the school pickup line, in the wash of the bleachers at the football game. There were skeptics. There had to be. Men who'd been burned by schemes that came with glossy brochures and left with dented roads. Women who'd done the math on their family budgets and didn't want to hear about easements unless easements bought school shoes. Charlotte didn't sermon. She told stories. She told about the fire and the hose and the gate. She told about the river's stubborn generosity. She talked about how low-impact luxury usually means the impact is low on the investors and high on the neighbors. She said, and people could tell she meant it, that money is a tool, not a weather system. You're allowed to decide what it builds instead of acting like it just happens. One evening, Ruth said, "We should feed folks while you explain this. Learning goes down better with brisket. Eli, call Gabe. See if the firehouse will loan us their pit if we promise not to oversalt the rub." Gabe, who has never in his life said no to a meal he didn't have to cook, wheeled the big smoker over to the Grange, and everybody brought something because that is how towns ones like Dry Creek lower the cost of admission to participation. On a Friday, framed in cicadas, Wade stood up in a clean shirt and said the sentence nobody had expected to hear him say without a fight. "I was wrong about some things," he said. He didn't elaborate in a way that pinned down pride too hard. "My girl and I, we got a plan. We're going to keep this place the kind of place where darkness is still useful to the night and cows still make sense. I need you all to hold me to it." Mrs. Alvarez stood, because she accepts apologies as down payments on better conduct. "We will," she said sweetly, and then she hugged him because forgiveness is a community project. Easements take time. Filing, approvals, signage, with enough acronyms to fill a bowl. But while paper walked through its paces, behavior changed. Wade stopped taking calls from Dallas men who used the word activation like a sacrament. He started saying yes to small repair jobs for neighbors and no to the part of himself that trusted checkbooks more than hands. Charlotte spent mornings in the south section checking fences and afternoons on the north walking the drawers with land trust folks who taught her plant names she'd never bothered to learn. She said switchgrass, like it was a person she'd neglected to invite to dinner. Eli fixed the hinge on her south gate as an excuse to stand there and listen while she practiced talking like a rancher in sentences that didn't apologize. There was a letter, too. Ruth found it in a box on a high shelf when she was looking for a punch bowl she hadn't used, since before the feed store got an espresso machine, they didn't have a soul to operate. The letter was addressed to "Whoever loves this place after me," in a hand that knew ink as well as dirt. It was from Eli's father, written in the last weeks when he knew time had turned from a straight road into a cul-de-sac. "I hope you are brave enough to keep the quiet dark." The man who wrote it had understood that stars are not scenery. They are a promise about scale. Ruth brought the letter to the meeting that night and read it aloud. When she said the last line, "Be the kind of neighbor who opens the gate without being asked," the room made that sound communities make when they agree to be proud of each other. The day the easement recorded, the county clerk, who had been in Eli's second-grade class and had once cut his hair on picture day because his mama wasn't home from her shift, handed Charlotte a stamped copy with relish. "Never thought I'd see the day a Beaumont gave the county more to keep than to sell," she said. "Feels like a new holiday." "We should celebrate it at night," Charlotte said. "Seems right for a dark sky promise." So they did. The Grange lawn hosted a potluck that leaned heavily toward deviled eggs and Jell-O salads, because people prefer their revolutions familiar-flavored. The band came back for free because they loved an audience that eats. Kids ran with glow sticks. Elderly men argued about whether the new fiberglass tanks were an improvement over the old galvanized ones, and Mrs. Alvarez held court at the pie table like a queen who had traded jewels for recipes and come out ahead. Wade danced with Ruth once, awkward, grateful, the kind of dance two people have when they find themselves on the same team after seasons of playing on opposite sidelines. He danced with his daughter too, and for the first time in years, he didn't try to steer from a distance. He followed, which is another way of saying he trusted. Eli stood at the edge and watched like a man who knows not to rush a thing that's finally moving in the right direction all by itself. Charlotte walked over. "You going to ask me," she said, "or you going to let the night boss you around?" "Ma'am," he said, and held out his hand, and they stepped into the song like people who understood rhythm as a kind of daily promise, not an occasion. Under the stars that were as bright as they'd ever be and would remain so by intention rather than accident, they didn't talk about money or gates or fires. They talked about small things. How many calves had been born on the McCrae place since the fire? 3. Whether the drizzles counted as rain, they did, where Ruth had gotten that new recipe for beans from a cousin in Kerrville. The night settled its weight gently on their shoulders. When the song ended, they stepped aside to the shade of the pecans. Wade approached, hands empty, face easy in a way that made him look 10 years younger or a decade more honest. He looked at Eli as if he'd finally learned how. "I'm hiring a manager for the grazing leases," he said. "Someone who can walk a fence and a spreadsheet. Someone who can tell me when I'm about to forget what I learned tonight. You want the job, Carter?" Eli's heart did that immodest thing again. He wanted to say yes quick. He wanted to say let me think slow. He did both in the right order. "I'll take it," he said. "On one condition." Wade raised an eyebrow. "Name it." We don't forget why we did this, and if you start to, you come sit on my porch and I'll read you my daddy's letter." Wade held out his hand and they shook, two men laying down a small treaty that mattered more than the paperwork it would later produce. "Are you happy?" Ruth asked Eli later as they took down lights so the stars could have their rightful work back. "I am," he said. "Not because of a job, because of a way of doing jobs." Charlotte walked up with a pie tin and a grin. "We didn't save the world," she said, "but we saved a corner of it that we can actually find on a map." "Maps are just promises," Ruth said. "Tonight we wrote one we can keep." People drifted home. The Grange yard emptied in the way barns do, slow, reluctant, with one last story told at a truck door and one last laugh that helps the night remember you were here. Eli and Charlotte stood in the gravel a minute longer, the crickets milky with their song. "Back where we started," she said. "Under the stars." He nodded. "Only different." "Because we are," she said. He didn't try to kiss her. Not because he didn't want to. Because some moments need a longer burn, and he was finally rich enough in patience to afford one. He walked her to her truck, opened her door, and the overhead light made a soft circle on the dust that rose around their boots. She climbed in and set her hands on the wheel like she'd taken hold of more than plastic. "See you in the morning, manager," she said. "See you in the morning, boss," he said, grinning because titles sound best when traded with a wink. She drove away slow, respecting a night she'd helped keep dark. He stood and watched until her taillights disappeared into the hill, then turned and looked up. The Milky Way spilled across the sky like someone had knocked over a salt shaker in heaven, and nobody was mad about the mess. He felt under his boot for the ground he loved and found it there, steady. He headed home, where the porch light waited like a small star a man could rightly call his own. And Dry Creek, which had witnessed bigger storms and worse mistakes, slept easier than it had in a long time, under a sky that had been preserved on purpose by neighbors who had finally remembered how to open the right gates at the right time.